conditions for deepening our understanding of modern European history by focusing on two regions, the Nordic-Baltic area and the Mediterranean, particularly its eastern part. It operates on two key assumptions. Firstly, that the histories of these regions are influenced by events at national, European, and global levels, shaping Europe as we know it today. And second, that while they share some common themes and tensions, they also have significant differences. Despite often being contrasted due to their differing development paths, especially during the recent financial crisis, this project aims to interrogate, if not challenge, this reflexive juxtaposition by bringing the regions together for a comparative study under the conceptual framework of smallness. Ultimately, Normid hopes to reevaluate the positions of these regions within Europe and to foster collaboration among researchers interested in comparative analysis, aiming for a richer understanding of European history. To do this, it seeks to invite scholars interested in these themes in order to exchange ideas as part of our extended research network. On that note, it's with pleasure that I introduce the second speaker in our seminar series, Apostolos Tsiouvalas. Apostolos is a PhD research fellow at the Norwegian Center for Law of the Sea at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, a research associate at the Arctic Institute Center for Circumpolar Security Studies, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and a board member of the Hellenic Polar Zone Society. He holds an LLM degree in polar law from the University of Akureyri in Iceland, and a master's in philosophy degree in Indigenous studies from the Arctic University of Norway, and a bachelor's degree in law from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Greece. Apostolos' main research interests center on legal anthropology, new materialisms, legal pluralism, indigenous rights, and environmental law in the Arctic. His doctoral project, which as I understand is close to being completed, is critically exploring law of the sea's understanding of motion in the world's oceans as an artifact of legal modernity, and seeks to revisit it in light of pre-modern theorizations of motion and legal anthropological research with Arctic indigenous communities. His impressive achievements as a young legal scholar include the award of fully funded fellowships from the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro, the University of Greenland, the Polar Cooperation Research Center in Japan, and the Sustainable Ocean Alliance Fellowship Program in Panama. In 2022, he was also honored with an award from the French Institute of Norway as the best early career scholar in Norway, focusing on ocean research, followed by research mobilities in Brest and Paris. Apostolos' very interesting seminar talk today is entitled Small States and Kinopolitical Power at Sea, Taming Nomadic Forces from Greenland to Greece. Under international law of the sea, state sovereignty governs relationships in ocean spaces. It's about how countries control movement and exercise authority there. Small countries use this power to limit other movements and to strengthen their global position. The talk will look at how non-country movements like nomadic groups clash with the power of these states. It will discuss Greenland, where Inuit people are controlled within certain areas, but also Greece's efforts to control migration in the Mediterranean Sea. It's a real pleasure to welcome you, Apostole. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kalpadakis, for the kind and long introduction, and Athena for facilitating the communication process. And it's really great to be with you today. Unfortunately, not in person. I was in Athens last week, but we couldn't arrange the meeting earlier. So let me try to share my slides. Yeah, fantastic. So as Dr. Kalpadakis mentioned, I have background both in international law. I'm graduate actually, in fact, from Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, and also background in Indigenous studies, which is a field mainly related around, revolved around social anthropology. And in my ongoing work, I'm trying to bridge these two disciplines together, drawing from a variety of lenses throughout humanities. Perhaps to start with a disclaimer, I'm not directly working with small states, but I'm conducting my research in Greenland for the last 4 years, and the topic can well relate also with the small state concept that you explore at NORMED. And second disclaimer, I'm not directly working also with the Mediterranean, perhaps except some preliminary work on Greece involvement in Arctic geopolitical scene. However, I will try to bridge the two regions and predominantly focus on Greenland while leaving some space and some open-ended questions to try to draw parallels and have a fruitful discussion about the same concepts applicable in a Mediterranean context. To start with, I will give you a short introduction of my ongoing research at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. And as George mentioned, I'm submitting my PhD in approximately 5 months from now, so it's been quite a hectic period, and I'm finalizing things, but feedback is always welcome for improvement and further revisions. So my topic today is small states and kinopolitical power at sea, taming nomadic forces from Greenland to Greece. And it's largely drawn on my current PhD work, which is based on a working group at the university trying to critically assess the concept of sovereignty as a fundamental pillar of international law in general. So under international law, the ocean space is governed by a relatively static and fragmented way determined by sovereign borders. For those of you familiar with international law or political science, political philosophy in general, the concept of state sovereignty emerging approximately around the 16th century, although arguably all the way back to the Roman times, has been the fundamental spatial unit of international law. And by spatial, I mean it has been the main unit determining the relationship of states, of human societies with surrounding world. So from the 16th century onwards, and the entire process of Westphalization of law and the Westphalian Treaty you may have heard, the state sovereignty initially developed on land during the feudal times, started slowly to project seawards in a way of drawing lines first upon the ocean space, first on coastal areas, and subsequently further away from the coast, drawing on a land-based mentality, on a territorial understanding of space first developed on the land. So the very idea of the legal order for the oceans is born on land. So today, the Constitution of the Oceans is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which determines exactly this sovereign relationship of states with the ocean space, and consolidated the partitioning of ocean space into different maritime zones, where according to international law, different levels of sovereignty, sovereign right, or jurisdiction are asserted to different areas. Disregarding its preamble that denotes that the problems of the ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole, NCLOS bringing forth this partitioning of the maritime space into different zones of sovereignty and jurisdiction. And this is almost paradoxical, as we are going to discuss subsequently. Under this understanding, approximately 30% of the world ocean is nowadays territorialized, striate, if I may use the Deleuzian term, which means that it's delineated within a certain maritime zone. So under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, we probably have here, we have the 12 nautical miles territorial sea, where states exercise full sovereignty, the exclusive economic zone all the way to 200 nautical miles, and the high seas beyond these 200 nautical miles, which is considered the area beyond national jurisdiction, which is still considered a commons, and the freedoms of the high seas are applicable, while states has also sovereign rights in their continental self all the way to 200 nautical miles, but with the possibility of extending themselves to 350 nautical miles in accordance with international law of the sea. The area beyond that is considered the area, which is referring to the common heritage of the mankind, meaning the deep seabed. These are very technical legal concepts, and as probably you're not familiar with international law, I'm not going to touch upon further. What I want to point out is that while at one hand, international law consolidated this partitioning of the marine space into maritime zones, in the 21st century, and arguably much earlier, the planet has been experiencing ever-increasing mobility patterns across different maritime zones, with many issues occurring in a transboundary context. We're talking about globalizations, lines, information, um, species traveling across the world, natural disasters, climate change propelling such changes to a great extent, and areas like the Arctic or the Mediterranean, which are warming much faster than the rest of the world, are highly impacted by such transboundary issues. At the same time, these sociological changes push both human and non-human beings on the planet to move across different areas, and therefore these rigid boundaries of the international law of the sea are crisscrossed by different activities on every moment. If someone thinks even the very phenomenology of the sea as such, compiled of a compilation of bubbles, water, waves, is not static at all, but it's constantly moving. So the oceans are in the heart of this new era, which is often framed by scholars as the Kinopolitical, and I'm borrowing here the term from a philosopher called Thomas Nile, which defines the Kinopolitical from the Greek kinesis, kino, and seen as a critical reimagination of the Anthropocene in light of motion. And the Kinopolitical constitutes basically the theoretical framework of my own research, and leads to what I will subsequently talk about, the concept of kinopolitics. So, under international law of the sea, and with the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea considered a living instrument, a living treaty, dynamism, motion is acknowledged to a great extent. The law of the sea fundamentally provides for cross-border activities, shipping, exploitation, conservation, the governance of shared, straddling, and highly migratory stocks, while it has been subsequently followed by other instruments such as the Fisheries Straddling Agreement, the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species, while in light of the most recent agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, discussions on area-based management tools, on dynamic area-based management tool, and marine protected areas are incrementally taking place. However, as the status quo of the planet's different boundaries today reveals, international law to a great extent fails to adequately regulate motion, adequately address transboundary activities, mainly in light to anthropogenic environmental challenges such as climate change, while this rigid sovereign architecture of international law of the sea, and not least on land, reveals that the law itself tends to approach motion merely as an emerging problem, as something that needs to be solved, halted, regulated, or at least marked out with grids and static designated border lines. Every kind of mobility across the oceans is legally treated in connection to established lines. So, therefore, the Kinocene as a lens, besides realizing this ever-increasing motion that we experience in the present era, is methodologically a useful tool to think about laws, and not least other social sciences, relationship to motion. How does law regulate motion? Why does this regulation how is this regulation being shaped? Why? Who is served by this way of regulating mobilities? And that leads to the concept of kinopolitics. Again, drawing from the Foucauldian traditional biopolitics, kinopolitics is the politics of movement. Is the study of politics and laws relations to mobility, to motion. Who is governing motion, for whose interest, and to the detriment of whose. So in what follows, I'm going to look a little bit at the law of the sea's regulation of motion, how different mobilities are mapped under the existing framework, but I'm not going to place so much focus on that, given that I expect from the audience a less legal background, while subsequently I'm touching upon the law of the sea's ontological conceptualization of motion. What is motion for law of the sea, for modern thinking in general, and how does the existing framework in place conceptualize motion? After setting that scene, I will pursue what I call a kinopolitical critique, while I will come to example how certain states and small states are exercising kinopolitical power. I can hear some echo, and I'm not sure if something is wrong online because I cannot see the Zoom.
We can't hear anything, like, we hear you perfectly.
Okay, excellent. So probably someone just opened the microphone online. Good. I continue. All right. So in that regard, I'm sharing three research questions. The first two are two of the main questions of my dissertation, and the third has been a little bit adjusted within the context of today's discussion on small states. So a first question I'm going to address is how does the law of the sea, sovereign architecture, the sovereign rigid regime regulate motion, and what challenge does it generate? Subsequently, how does the law of the sea ontologically and not least epistemologically conceptualize motion? And is this the only way of thinking about motion across the world? And to problematize that, I will share some insights from my own legal anthropological work with the Inuit communities of Northwest Greenland, which is an Arctic indigenous group, while afterwards I will unpack this kinopolitical critique to discuss how do small states empowered by international law may exercise kinopolitical power. So my research is comprised of both theoretical research and empirical research, but I'm not really going to develop that now here. So to start with the law of the sea's regulation of motion, under the existing framework, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and the rest of international law applicable to the oceans is often praised as a comprehensive regime of ocean governance that addresses navigation, conservation, resource exploitation, scientific research, and many other issues in a transjurisdictional nexus, in a transboundary nexus, and the system has successfully settled the relationship among sovereign states. In that regard, complementary instruments have been adopted, such as the Strategic Fisheries Agreement that I mentioned, that have been adopted to respond to further and emerging transboundary mobilities in the sea, while through interaction with other regimes, such as the climate regime, the international law of the sea tries to respond to other ongoing challenges. However, literature has long now observed that the existing regime in place does not fully encapsulate the dynamism of ocean system. For example, when it comes to living beings, the oceans are suffering from mismanagement, overexploitation, largely because states are sharing certain stocks, and the way the sovereign regime regulates living resource management is not always responding to the actual natural mobility of beings across the world's oceans. Under existing regime, literature further observes that other non-human mobile actors are reduced to objects of exploitation, conservation, determined by the different levels of asserted sovereignty and adjacency from the land as of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And here there is a large critique among scholars regarding the anthropocentric layers of international law of the sea and the very idea of state-centrism in shaping law and international relations. So therefore, environmental law often receives similar critiques. Even area-based management tools that come to encapsulate mobility are often criticized as a new formula projected upon the oceans to bring the same territorial understanding of drawing lines upon the sea. On the other hand, other mobilities in the sea, such as those of indigenous peoples, that are often not seeing lines in the ocean and are extending across maritime zones, are very often not receiving recognition. The international law of the sea has only a few exceptions on traditional fishing rights across jurisdictions of different maritime zones, mainly in the context of archipelagic states, while it has no reference to indigenous peoples in general. While on the other hand, human rights instruments dealing with indigenous mobilities across different states zones are not always implemented within national jurisdiction or may lead to conflicts with existing with existing legal architecture of the oceans. And in that regard, there is only a few such examples of recognition. And so far in the Arctic, where I do live and where my main research has been unfolding, there are no oceanic, indigenous, or any other local or nomadic activities enabled in a transboundary context. And most Arctic indigenous communities are currently highly sedentary, located in single delineated areas, and are not allowed to pursue their traditional livelihoods and chase wildlife or have cultural exchanges with other groups across different maritime zones. So I'm concluding here that under this existing legal framework, and this argument could also be built upon other considerations of the law of the sea, such as the regulation of the dynamism of the sea ice that I'm exploring in my dissertation. So under the existing framework, although the dynamism is partially acknowledged, motion is always regulated in sovereign state-centered terms and always disciplined by way of boundaries. And paradoxically, this is what I call the Kinosin paradox. There is a way of stasis, a way of static boundaries to regulate kinesis, to regulate motion across the world. So the second question that raised actually my curiosity after my first conclusion is what means motion, because everything is motion. We're all in motion. And I wanted to investigate what does how does law understand motion, and which are the deeper onto-epistemological underpinnings that are shaping the existing legal regime in place. So the law of the sea, like every other field of international law, it considered a product of legal modernity, the sociocultural paradigm that emerged in continental Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and ever since the entire way that the Western mind approaches knowledge has been shaped. And I did some research on pre-modern theories of motion, and I found that from the ancient Greek atomist philosophers to Plato's Timaeus dialogue, or Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, or even in Roman thought with Lucretius and his famous poem De Rerum Natura, the very idea of motion was a very complex category that was equally treated to time, space, and considered a definer of all reality. It was often attributed to some external forces, some external unmoved mover, some agent outside the human rationality that has been shaping all mobilities in the universe, and was a concept always intriguing the genuine intellectual curiosity of the scholar. But from modernity onwards, however, what basically meant motion is locomotion. And characteristically, in his famous Principia philosophy that shaped much of Western thought from 17th century onwards, René Descartes attributed to motion to a definition that basically claims that motion is nothing more than the action by which a body passes from one place to another. So basically, an object moving from a point A to a point B, and this annihilation of distance through mobility can be measured, can be controlled, can be fully comprehended by the modern subject. Descartes went even further in his Principia, claiming that any other philosopher that has tried to theorize motion in a more complex way than basically locomotion is rather naive, or we shouldn't basically take into account anything prior. So with motion being as locomotion, it became a subject of physics, mathematics, Newtonian laws, and the way we understand motion today and movement in everyday life. So from a philosophical category, a question of metaphysics became a non-philosophical category, a question of physics reduced to physical measurements within space, and that way it disregarded any other non-measurable qualities or any unanswered questions about its nature. such as motion as culture, way of being, identity, motion as emotions, as Hobbes, for example, wrote in another seminal work, and so on. And ever since, motion became one of the less discussed concepts in law. Law takes for granted that motion is locomotion. It's fully understandable, fully controlled, and a sovereign state, by definition, adheres to a single understanding of motion, no matter if the state is big or small or so on. So that on international law's ontological conceptualization of motion. And then I'm going to share some insights from my own empirical work with Arctic indigenous communities that came to demonstrate that motion can be something more than what the Western modern and the modern legal subject thinks. And as I mentioned, subsequently, I will try to link it a little bit with the Mediterranean and discuss how Mediterranean states such as Greece or Turkey may in exercise of sovereignty control exactly the motion, control mobilities, control nomadic forces and people and groups or individuals. They are not certainly ontologically or sharing the same rationale with a sovereign state. So to start with, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the brown area on the top right, named as Avanerswak, is the area where I carried out my PhD fieldwork and the communities I have been working for the last 4 years in Northwest Greenland. This is a linguistic map, and I don't ask you to pay attention. Just I would like just to locate you cartographically. Interestingly, though, the language spoken by the Inuit, which is Inuktun, the name of the language, it's much closer to Inuit dialects in Canada, even in Alaska, rather than the language of Kalaallisut, where the mainstream Greenlandic society speaks in the south. And also, these communities are culturally way closer to Canada. And I'm pointing here the island of Ellesmere and the entire Canadian coastal. This is all that here is Canada, and then is Greenland. But we're going to zoom a little bit more into the map now. So I spent about 1 month in the field in the small communities, Inuit communities of Kanak, Shirapaluk, and the McCormick Fjord in Avanerswak, North Greenland. And I also spent some time in the capital of Greenland, Nuuk, where there I engaged with formal institutions. So the Inuit are the northernmost Inuit population and are the northernmost people residing on this planet. And until the early 19th century, they never encountered Europeans. So they have traditionally living on the grounds of subsistence hunting and fishing, quite isolated from the rest of the Greenlandic population, with colonization of the north of Greenland occurring approximately 200 years after the rest of the country. And they have maintained up to date a very distinct way of living as a semi-nomadic tribe in the high Arctic. So I participated in the field in different subsistence hunting and fishing and sailing activities. And I also carried out interviews with different community members and hunters, trying to trace their own distinct understanding of motion and how the latter has been currently taken into account by Greenland, a country, part of the Kingdom of Denmark that is trying to slowly pursue decolonization and gain full autonomy in a sovereign sense. So these communities have been, as I mentioned, living in the edge of Greenland and Canada, have been traditionally crossing the sea ice of this area here called the Pikialasorsuaq, which is a semi-frozen area. So they have been crossing with kayaks in the summer and for most of the years with dog sledding, and they have been for centuries practicing hunting and fishing activities, hunting for walruses, seals, polar bears, narwhals, and basically muskox, and basically everything that you can find in the region around the communities. So I would like to mention that this island actually for many years until very recently was not used at all by Canada, and there is only a settlement here in the very south. So these are all old Inuit hunting grounds. Today, the community, however, in response to modern services and other sedentarization schemes, is mainly concentrated around the communities I mentioned, the small villages. However, there is still a strong understanding of being mobile in space. And mobility in space, motion, has been central to the Inuit, to the identity of the Inuit, which have never basically resided in delineated settlements until the mid-20th century. So as mentioned, they have a very tight connection with the North Water Polynya, which is this area here, which is the richest area in biodiversity northern of the Arctic Circle. And as themselves mention, there is a very sense of interconnectivity between the ice, the weather, the animals, the food culture and well-being around the North Water Polynya, while by operating cross-border mobility across between Greenland and Canada, they have also developed strong cultural bonds and families between the two sides. So, however, in accordance with international law, in 1973, Greenland and Canada signed the delimitation agreement of their maritime boundaries, which basically came to cut, as you can see on the last map here, the maritime zone between the two states into two different zones belonging to the exclusive economic zone of Greenland and Canada, respectively. I would like to mention that the closest point for the Inuit to cross all the way to Canada is this cape here in Cape Alexander in Eta, and we're talking about a distance of 30 kilometers that can be easily traversed with dog sledding in less than 2 days. So I did, as mentioned, interviews and participant observation with hunters in different activities, trying to trace a local understanding of motion, which is but before delving into that, I would like to mention that besides the adoption of the 1973 agreement, the hunters used to pursue traditional activities for much longer and until the early 2000s, all the way to Ellesmere Island in Canada, in order to chase walruses, polar bears, narwhals, and whatever else they needed for community subsistence. Besides the modern services and the sedentarization, from the 90s onwards, mobility has been extremely restricted within the area around their villages, and that's mainly because of the increase of securitization policy throughout the American coast, and especially after the September 11 attack and the increase of Canadian patrolling. Until that time, they didn't really bother if 700 community members are engaged in a transboundary activity. So today, in response to climate change and these increasing sedentarization policies, their traditional livelihoods are at a critical risk because there is not much game, much marine wildlife attached to their communities, and services are and modern products and services are not always accessible to town. So scholars are talking about the end of nature for this community, in the sense that what always meant for them traditional way of life is not possible. And yeah, I'm going to share now some quotes from the field, trying to get what mobility, what being mobile in space, what motion means for those hunters. So, and here you can see a photo from the village of Shirapaluk, where I visited, which is the northmost village on the planet, and it's predominantly based on traditional hunting. In the biggest settlement of Kanak, it's approximately 10% of the population that is still hunters, but somehow every family is still dependent on subsistence activities. And an old hunter told me, our ancestors were nomads. For us, motion in the sea is everything. We have to travel to find our meat, to travel to find to wear skin to wear, to travel to hunt, to eat and feed our dogs, and warm ourselves from the blubber. Now nomadism is forbidden. We are adjusted to the animal movement in the sea. We go where the animals go, and the animals do not see borderlines, said another hunter that I talked. So, and here you can see a portable house actually that can be actually carried by dogs on the sea ice continuum all the way to Canada back in time, but within a certain delineated area now, according to domestic legislation, and denotes how nomadic is their way of living even in the coldest months of the year. Another hunters mentioned that motion in the sea means for us access to healthy food. Our people need food to survive. To achieve that, we need to travel as much as needed. Everything is in a constant movement around the Polonia. We travel to Ellesmere in Canada to chase walruses and bears, while narwhals, reindeer, and fish migrate from Canada here in the summer. And every movement depends on the ice that inconsistently changes all the time. I wish that lines in the sea did not exist. I don't like that the healthy food I can eat is being closed by restrictions. We, like the animals, have territories, someone else said. We need territories as predators where we hunt. In the sea, though, we are all predators and we hunt everywhere. Where you hunt should determine your territory and not border lines. Our laws always carried for the animal stocks without establishing borders and quotas in a Western sense. So the same process I observed in traditional fishing for Arctic char, which is salmonid growing only in high Arctic latitudes. And fishing basically starts when the sea ice drifts away from the fjords and opens a navigable passage so they can actually reach some coast. And we spent 6 days in Macoming Fjord camping and fishing. And there I observed that fishing itself was a constant mobile activity from many aspects. The fish is coming mainly from Canada, so they had to wait for that to reach their communities. They had to travel to reach good fishing spots. Streams are drifting the fish towards the community's gill nets, while calved icebergs constantly come into the fjord, mainly because of rapid global warming of warming of the glaciers all the time, and these calved icebergs constantly were tangling with our nets and making fishing even more difficult, while drifting icebergs could also bring polar bears. So some of the community members or some of the hunters that we were actually out in the field had to patrol for polar bears. So furthermore, the fishing depends on the motion of tides, and the behavior of the fish is largely is largely impacted by the way tides are shaping in these latitudes. And the hunters could read the movement of the clouds from all directions and could predict what the ice wind in the sky or the movement of the clouds could mean for the behavior of the fish and therefore for human activities. So I concluded therefore that subsistence fishing demonstrates a more than human understanding of motion for them, as it's not simply locomotion, but it's a complex activity involving different mobile actors. And I mean, that may also be relevant for any kind of fishing, also in Western frameworks, you might be wondering. But as the hunters verified many times, this is a very distinct understanding of understanding motion carried from father to son with intergenerational knowledge transfer, indigenous tradition, indigenous knowledge involved, and for them motion is everything. And I would like to mention that the name of Piñatorshuak, which in the local language means the great hunter, denotes this hunter that is mobile in essence, the hunter that would never stay for for extended periods of time in their settlements. And while being there, I noticed that several of them hunters were still labeled as Piñatorshuak in the sense that they were always absent, always out hunting, never staying at one single place. So to summarize, and here you can see actually it's pretty cool. It's a narwhal with a double tooth. That's quite rare and brings luck to the community if someone catches that. And I concluded that for the Inuit, their own distinct ontological understanding of motion, motion is a way of being. It's a cultural, constitutes a cultural practice that extends across maritime zones, and their own understanding of law has been shaped in that regard. It's crucial for food security and largely depends on animal mobility patterns. The hunters move where the animals move, and the animals move where the sea ice move, and how that dynamically and unpredictably shapes the whole year, while the community elders hold strong knowledge in order to basically read these ice dynamics, and constitutes therefore this more than human understanding of motion. It's further legally conceptualized as a phenomenon unlimited by constructed boundaries. However, as I mentioned, Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark as a whole is adhering to a certain territorial understanding of space, exercises sovereignty over space, and restricts maritime activities of the Inuit within a very small delineated territory attached to their coast, and regulated strictly by established quotas. So this propels us to think about how Greenland controls motion, and Denmark as a whole, and the concept of kinopolitics. And I try to link that also a little bit with the concept of small states. And I would like to mention that yeah, from 1979, Greenland has achieved a certain degree of autonomy, but from 2009, is developed a self-government, which is in charge for natural resource management. So the way Greenland determines marine living resource management is decided at the local level, while issues such as international relations, defense, security lie with the Kingdom of Denmark as a whole, as long as the delineation of maritime zones. And I'm quoting here a famous proposition from Deleuze nomadology that basically says that one of the fundamental tasks of the state is to striate, which means to draw lines, to delineate the space over which it reigns, or to utilize smooth spaces such as the oceans as a means of communication in the service of striated space. This exactly reflects how the ocean's legal architecture is organized, and it is a vital concern of every state, not only to vanquish nomadism, but to control any kind of mobility and migration. And we can see here that Greenland is exactly pursuing this policy. And international law, the sovereign state is the main, if not the only agent of kinopolitical power, because arguably powerful corporations have also some sort of kinetic agency, but I'm not delving into this single short lecture. So under its own commitment to international law, Greenland, while not yet being a state, but in a quest for decolonization, in a quest for international recognition, it sees like a state. And I'm borrowing here a term from James Scott, which by seeing like a state basically explains how a certain mentality may be adhered to a group even without yet being a state. So under this state-centric and sovereign understanding, and under this mainstream modern ontology of motion, disregarding the fact that Greenland consists approximately 90% of Inuit, indigenous peoples, and many different groups that have been traditionally nomadic. It has currently vanished nomadism. It has currently promoted modernization, sedentarization, and tries to control any kind of mobilities in space. It further takes that further to denies to recognize its own indigenous peoples, such as the Inuit, who claim cross-boundary ties with Canadian groups and have been always traversing the marine space in pursuing traditional activities. And recently, the government of Greenland mentioned that the Inuit do not constitute a tribal people or a particular indigenous people within or coexisting with the Greenlandic people as a whole. And similarly, the Kingdom of Denmark, in implementation of the International Labour Organization Convention 169 on the rights of indigenous peoples, they have further claimed that there is only one indigenous people in Denmark, and this is the Inuit of Greenland. So therefore, adhering to international law of the sea automatically for any kind of state legitimizes the exercise of kinopolitical power. And I try to apply this rationale in in the context of the Mediterranean, thinking in particular of the case of Greece, to discuss how Mediterranean states endorse these sovereign logics, develop maritime zones in accordance with international customary law on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and exercise kinopolitical power within these zones. I think it's even further interesting for Greece because Greece, being a small coastal nation, is also the frontier of a larger sovereign entity. If we think of the EU as a whole, so Greece plays a crucial role as a front line of the EU in controlling movement within its own territorial integrity, but also within the external borders of the Union. And today in the Mediterranean Sea, there are no indigenous nomads, such as in the Arctic where I do live. And the only indigenous peoples in Europe is the Sami of Scandinavia, and they are way far from the Mediterranean context. So perhaps the only nomad in the Mediterranean context that someone could think is the migrant, the refugee, the subject that basically lacks a territorial attachment in a sovereign sense and traverses a smooth space unbounded by lines. However, coastal states in the Mediterranean and like elsewhere, they control motion, they control the mobility of these nomad subjects and employ different measures, including Coast Guard patrols, pushbacks, to prevent unauthorized crossing and manage the movement of people, including refugees. Similar mentality is applicable on land, much exaggerated by the establishment of the land border on Evros, while while predominantly Turkey, but also Greece is criticized for weaponizing, movement through these migrant waves in the exercise of sovereignty. So, in addition, mobility is further seized by taking migrants to unofficial detention facilities, seizing their movement, and there is records reporting actors involved into such detentions, involving the police, Coast Guard, border guards, the army, Frontex, and even paramilitary groups or persons, as we have all probably seen some unpleasant videos also for Greek civilians. So I therefore argue that Greece seems to exercise its sovereignty through the kinopolitical control of the bodies of the people attempting to cross its border, either through pushbacks, through state deals, or, for example, even indirectly by rendering asylum application process difficult and with many migrants stuck on camps on Greek islands for extended periods of times, while on the other hand, Turkey uses this motion through this weaponization of movement as a tool to push border and as a leverage to react to different developments and make demands towards the EU, while Greece, like Greenland, trying to adhere to a European larger migration policy, tries to use this a sort of authoritization of the way it regulates mobilities and exercise sovereign power in sort of an excessive form. So, but I will stop the Mediterranean discussion here, also because I've covered the 45 minutes, but mainly because it's way beyond my area of expertise. However, I welcome you to reflect upon that, and I basically conclude that in both examples, both in Greenland but in the Mediterranean, the kinopolitical power of the sovereign state, whether small or big, determines the ability to exercise mobility, to control mobility as an exertion of sovereign power, and demarcate whether particular people should belong and under which condition. And this is a powerful manifestation of sovereignty. So, and I finally, in case we don't have time, but I think we're gonna cover the time pretty well. I have also addressed some questions to discuss, such as if you see other kinopolitical power dynamics in small Mediterranean states, because I'll be highly interested in engaging further with this discussion and exploring more examples from small states in the south. while I was thinking that this very idea of kinopolitics, the exercise of control over movement, can also be imagined in post-territorial terms, in the sense, what about other mobilities such as fluid genders or identity or non-humans, capital mobilities, and in the sea or on land or in general, anyway, how capital flows and how certain mobilities such as the capital ones are enabled and prioritized by the global neoliberal order, and also yeah, if you can see any difference in the exercise of kinopolitical power when a state is small or big, because to my very understanding, this idea of adhering to a sovereign logic is always leading to some sort of kinopolitical control. And with that, I would like to thank you and share this photo from the fieldwork. And this is basically the first toy that the Inuit kids get. And this is a kayak with two rows for paddling. And before getting to the sea, this is where they practice paddling to become a great hunter, denoting that from the very born, from from an early stage of their lives, Inuit hunters are trained to be mobile. Thank you.